Hello, it's good to see you on tonight. Sergey, very cool. Glad to have you on. And Dave Mercer, it is right. It's time to geek out. We're going to be geeking out about some good fundamental stuff when it comes to music. And it's something that is so fundamental that it is easily one of the most overlooked things in all of music. And it is why scales sound so good. Now, much of the time, and actually, before I jump into it, if you're part of the replay crew, let us know where you're coming from. And as you join, always interested. If you're new here, let us know where you're at. And if you're not, always love to know where everyone's at. Okay, so why scales sound so good? Now, that's kind of the question behind the question, because the first question is, why do we even play scales in the first place? It's a given when you get into music, whatever instrument you play, whether you're practicing the bass, the guitar, if you're into the keyboard, you're going to have instructors who tell you, or just the world at large will tell you, you have to play your scales, practice your scales. And it's just this kind of dogmatic knee-jerk reaction to getting into an instrument. So scales are hammered into you from day one. And sometimes people will explain why that's important. And so that's, one of the questions is why scales? And the short answer is because scales are the foundation of, and we looked at this in previous live stream, scales are the foundation of melodies, chords, modes, progressions, like everything. Everything in music is pretty much founded on scales. So it's important to know scales. And just having the fluid finger movement helps you navigate, whether it's the fretboard or the keyboard, having a sense of where the notes are, because scales are really musical patterns. It's just sequences of intervals. And we're going to get into one of the core fundamental patterns here. So that's nice. Play scales. Okay, because they're fundamental to music. They're important. Okay, so let's play them. But the next question is, why do they sound so good? Is it just because, you just hope to play notes in sequence, and because of whole steps and half steps, they sound good? Like, there's more to it than just because they sound good. There's a reason why they sound good. So we're gonna get into that. And we're gonna use the major scale as the basis of our analysis here, because the major scale is so fundamental, and you're gonna see why. And the major scale is really the source of all modes. All modes are permutations of the major scale. So let's get into what we're talking about here. And let's say we start with the C major scale. Now, I have a diagram here where I'm just so I can mark it up, but we'll actually turn to an instrument so we can hear it. But the C major scale, for example, is, you start on a C note and you play a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, or whole, half, whole, half. So on a keyboard here, let's say we have a C, and we have C, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. It sounds so good that it could have been crafted by angels, right? It's just this wonderful pattern. But let's get into what is going on here. And to really understand why scales are important and why they sound so good, it comes down to a fundamental connection between the holy trinity of musical patterns, or the chromatic scale, the major scale, and the circle of fifths. These are three exotic sounding names. And if you've been here as part of the tribe for a bit, you know that these are fundamental patterns, but we're going to get into a really cool connection between them that once you see it, you can't unsee it when it comes to scales and everything that stems from those, including modes, chords, and progressions. Okay, so these three patterns are intricately intertwined. And if we look at the three patterns as concentric rings, we have at the center here the chromatic scale. It's just the 12 notes of music repeated in a cycle through multiple octaves and then it's because music is cyclical, it circles back onto itself. And then if we, in this middle ring, if we zoom in a little bit, we have, for example, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. That's the C major scale. And then, because that pattern bleeds into the next, we have G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. That's the G major scale, and so on. So we have, and that so on forms every fifth note of the previous scale is what forms the circle of fifths. So really, the chromatic scale, this inner ring, the major scale, the middle ring, and the circle of fifths, this outer ring, there are three concentric rings. They're not just randomly disconnected patterns. They actually are related. They're fractal in that they stem from and refer to themselves at every level. Okay, so these three patterns are really important. And if we just kind of simplify it here to looking at a keyboard, looking at the circle of fifths as it relates to, say, a musical instrument. Oh, I'm not showing my diagram. Pardon, you're not showing the keyboard. Tanidri, thank you. I was showing the keyboard, and so I have had a habit of doing that the last couple of times. I get so excited that I just like jump into diagrams. So let me just recap that one more time, okay? So we have the three concentric rings. We have the chromatic scale, and then we have the major scales, which are formed from the chromatic scale. It's basically just taking those patterns and then deriving major scales from that. And then we have from that the circle of fifths, okay? So with just in the key of C, as a quick recap, we have the key of C, and from that we have the C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and that is the C major scale. Then we have the G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, that is the G major scale, and so on. The and so on is the circle of fifths, every fifth note. So these three concentric rings, the chromatic scale, the major scale, and the circle of fifths, are just different looks at the same pattern, just different subsets and relationships between those notes. Okay, so back to this diagram, which is it's a simplified version of basically the same thing, but showing it on a keyboard. So the keys, the black and white keys, this inner ring shows the chromatic scale. And then if we use the pattern of whole steps and half steps, we then have the major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, which is the C major scale. It's the key of C, and then G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. It's the G major scale, and so on. So it's just the same thing, but it's a little more relatable in the real world because it's applied to an actual keyboard, okay? So this relationship here is going to inform what we're going to see next. Now, we've looked at variations of these diagrams in some previous videos, but this is going to get really cool here. So check this out. So back to the C major scale. We're going to zoom in and focus on just the C major scale. So on the keyboard, and I'm not going to forget to come back to the diagram after this, we have the C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, okay? So that is the C major scale. Basically, we're taking the chromatic scale and we're trimming out the notes that we're skipping with the whole steps and half steps. So the black keys in this case, because we're focusing on the key of C. And we just are left with these notes, the C major scale. So just by skipping some notes, in the case of C major, the black keys, with just the white keys, it's this sonorous, pleasing pattern. But why is it sonorous? Why is it pleasing? What's up with these particular notes? The colors are kind of hinting at that. You can kind of see a relationship between the colors that are played on the white keys. But we're going to dive in even further so it really jumps out. And that is by not just looking at things in a linear way. Because music is cyclical, we started with the chromatic scale circle, the major scales that are derived from that, and then the circle of fifths. It's all cyclical. But when we look at things on a keyboard, you can quickly, lose track of the fact that it's cyclical. So basically, we took the chromatic scale, we snipped it with some scissors, just at any given point. We snipped right here. And then now we're unwrapping it and or sorry, we're not unwrapping it, we're wrapping it back into a loop. And so if we bring it back into this pattern, we have now, again, a circular formation. And in this circular formation, we're going to be able to see things that are a little harder to see in a linear format. And on the keyboard, it's a linear format because it's a straight line. But the same thing applies to a guitar. It's a linear format. Every string is just a vertical line, or just a horizontal line, depending on how you're holding the guitar. But every string is its own chromatic scale. And then on the guitar with stacked strings, all of these relationships can get obscured. So we're just condensing things into the simplest formation of notes, the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. Because here we have C, D flat D, E flat E, F, G flat G, A flat A, B flat B. It is the chromatic scale. But from one octave to the next, we're forgetting octaves. This is called pitch space. So we're like, forget the octaves. We're just looking at how the pattern loops into itself in what's called pitch space, okay? So now that we have music in a cyclical format, we can wrap our eyes and minds around what's going on. And once you see what's going on, like I say, you can't unsee it. So what this pattern is showing is, we're just using color music with the colors and the shapes to look at this pattern. But really what this is, if we just kind of let the colors fade out and just focus on the underlying pattern, it is the chromatic scale of a keyboard. So we have, white, black, white, black, white, black. It's basically just the 2 black keys and then the 3 black keys of a keyboard, just like we have 2 black keys and 3 black keys. We're looking in an octave of a keyboard, just in a circular formation, right? So, but the challenge with the black and white topography of a keyboard is that the black and white, the contrast between them is so pronounced, and it's such an iconic pattern that it's like you're blinded by and assume importance in that pattern, when really what matters is the underlying whole steps and half steps of the chromatic scale. So that said, we're going to bring it back into the chromatic scale with the colors and the shapes. And this shows that pattern. Again, we have the black keys right here, 2 black keys, 3 black keys. With the colors and shapes, we're going to have more insight than the black and white would provide alone. Okay. So keyboard here on the right, chromatic scale here on the left. And so let me just give that some sound. We have the chromatic scale. Okay. So we're working with an octave of the chromatic scale. And let's say that because as before, we skipped some of the whole steps and half steps to just focus on a single pattern, in this case, C major. And when we skipped some of those notes, because of the way that the topography of the keyboard is we actually happen to skip all of the black keys. So you can see here that C major is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. It's just the C major scale. Okay, so that is all right. So that's nice, but what is up with that pattern? Why does it sound good? It comes back to that relationship that we looked at a moment ago between the chromatic scale, the major scale, and the circle of fifths. When we looked at them as concentric rings, you can see that they're all related. The chromatic scale is like the mother of all note patterns. The major scale springs from the chromatic scale. It's a subset. Each major scale and each key is a subset of the major scale by skipping different notes. And then the circle of fifths is a subset of that because you're skipping even more notes to only focus on every fifth note, all of the keys in a sequence. Now, once you get to the circle of fifths, which you can see using the color wheel, because just as all keys overlap in music, all of the colors bleed seamlessly into one another. So the chromatic scale, or the circle of fifths and the color wheel are the same. And when you condense the circle of fifths into just 12 notes, you have the color wheel. Then if you rotate every other note from the circle of fifths into the chromatic scale, you get the chromatic scale. So for example, we have, we've done this rotation. So we took all of the notes that are evenly spaced, like all of those notes, and we swapped places. Actually, in this case, we took all of the circles and we swapped places, because it used to be C, D, E, F. F swapped places with B, and then G swapped places with D flat, and then A swapped places with E flat, and then we had B, which was where F was, and then back to C. So by swapping every other note, we went from the circle of fifths to the chromatic scale. And then if we focus on just the notes of the major scale and then rotate that into the circle of fifths, if we rotate the major scale into a circle of fifths pattern, you see that all of the notes are just adjacent in the circle of fifths. And that is really why those notes sound good together, because they're old neighbors from an old neighborhood. In the chromatic scale, they're all separated and far apart. Let me get rid of some of these dots so I'm starting with a clean slate. In the chromatic scale, all of these notes are separated. They've been scattered. But if you go back to their old playground of relationships as they're naturally arranged, each note is nestled between its close friends. C is between F and G. G is between C and D. D is between G and A, and so on. They're all like snuggled up together to personify it as a metaphor. So you have the major scale scatters the notes, and that's why we have whole steps and half steps, because when you rotate that pattern back into the circle of fifths, you have a formation where you're like, oh, those notes are clearly adjacent, they're clearly related, and that's why they sound consonant or compatible with one another, because they're old friends. So if we look at it on an actual keyboard, because of that swap of notes to get from the chromatic scale to the circle of fifths, C swapped places with its tritone, G flat. In other words, C, red, wants to be where that note is, between F and G, or between purple red and red orange. So C is at home between those two notes. Likewise, D swapped places with its tritone, orange and blue, or in this case A flat, swapped places. So D wants to be between G and A. And then E, yellow, swapped places with B flat, purple. E wants to be between A and B. So E is at home between those three. So basically these three notes used to be right here, which would have been nestled between their friends in the old neighborhood. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, or red, orange, yellow to the old neighborhood of purple, red, red, orange, orange, yellow, yellow, green, and then back to red. So it's almost like the chromatic scale is like a family reunion or a high school reunion. It's a reunion of old friends coming back together, being close to each other. But normally in the chromatic scale, everyone's scattered. They've gone their separate ways, but they still have those affinities. You can see here that C has a natural affinity with F and G. D longs to be back with G and A, and E has fond memories. Well, my lines are a little bit off, but E has fond memories of being between B and A. All of these relationships are there. They're baked into the chromatic scale, but they're informed by those relationships in the circle of fifths. Another way to look at it is, we're using a family reunion as the metaphor, but imagine it as, and here's that side by side, actually, before I get to my next metaphor. But you can see it more clearly here side by side. You have the chromatic scale formation that from which the major scale, the C major scale, arises through whole steps and half steps. And then you have the circle of fifths highlighting the notes of the C major scale. Clearly those notes are related because of their relationship in the circle of fifths. Okay, so this is the old formation. This is how they're naturally aligned, and then this is the new formation after the great shift, after the great rotation from the circle of fifths to the chromatic scale. Okay, so another way to think of this is it's almost like the tectonic plate shifts of Pangea. If you're familiar with Pangea in geologic history, you have these, oh, what's up with these shapes? Like South America, it almost looks like a puzzle piece where this could fit right there. And then likewise, North America looks almost like puzzle pieces that have been scattered where it wants to kind of be nestled right there. Well, in Pangea, if you put all the puzzle pieces together through vast geologic time, you have all of these pieces that are naturally, they're like old neighbors, they're old friends. And so you can think of the major scale like that. It's almost like the major scale as we know it of whole steps and half steps is really just hearkening back to an old musical Pangea, as it were. Helps to think of that way. Now, of course, music is cyclical and symmetrical. So these same patterns apply not only to the key of C, but to any key. So we're going to look at a couple of keys. I'll have diagrams in the library that walk through all of the keys, so you can really just hammer it in playing in all of the different keys. But for purposes of illustration, let's look at the key of G. Same idea applies. So we have G, and then whole step to A, whole step to B, half step to C, whole step, half step. Now, because we're starting on G and that pattern of whole steps and half steps, it introduces this black key, or F sharp. Now, in the vernacular of music, it's easy to think that F sharp has some special significance, like F sharp, oh, sharp. Sharp's different than a natural note. There's something. No, it's just whole steps and half steps. It has to do with the use of black keys and white keys, but it's still the same pattern of whole steps and half steps. And if we look at the rotation, if we do that same rotation by taking every other note and rotating them 180 degrees into the circle of fifths, we get another grouping that are side by side. It's the same concept of old friends who are neighbors in the circle of fifths. Only in this case, instead of just focusing on the white keys, like in the key of C, we have shifted over one. So now we have a black key with F sharp. Same idea though. Let's look at another key, the key of D. In this case, we're starting on D. So it's D, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Because we have D and the underlying pattern of whole steps and half steps, now we have an F sharp and a C sharp. But again, there's undue attention given to the sharps and the flats. We really don't care about sharps and flats. We can see it because we're showing the black and white keys here, but with just the patterns alone, if we look at just D, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, it's just whole steps and half steps. We have whole steps that are all squares here, and then we get into the half step to the circles, and then whole steps through the circles. Who cares that those are black keys? Only those who are fixated on or think through the paradigm of traditional notation and the use of key signatures, that's where the significance of sharps comes in. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter. In fact, to that point, and here's the key of D. If we rotate them again, now we have all of these notes that are in the key of D, but in a circle of fifths formation. Same idea. All of the neighbors are showing up in the circle of fifths. So again, if we look at the circle of fifths and how all of the keys, all of these major scales overlap, you can see that, oh, okay, it's really about the whole steps and half steps. We don't really care so much about the sharps and flats. But if we were to look at the sharps and flats, just out of curiosity, you can see here that it's just the black and white. So anything that's a gray is faded out. It's one of the skipped notes. So in this case, we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. you can see that the key of C is all white keys. And then if we start on G, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, we have one F sharp. If we start on, let me just get it a little cleaner so it's easy to see. If we start on D, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, we have that, F sharp and C sharp. And so this increasing number of sharps as we go in a clockwise direction, or increasing number of flats as we go in a counterclockwise direction, accounts for this, which is the traditional iconic look at the circle of fifths, where the key of C has no sharps or flats. So that's why it's depicted as a key signature that's just blank. The key of G, because of that pattern of whole steps, it introduces a sharp, F sharp. And so that's why the key of G is depicted as a key signature with one sharp. And likewise, increasing numbers of sharps as we go this way, or counterclockwise, increasing number of flats as we go that way. But this is such an abstraction. Like you have to, there's so many things that you have to know in order for that to make sense. You have to know which note falls on which staff line or space. You have to know what the hell that pound symbol even means. You have to know what this means. There's another video I have about the clefs and what they symbolize. And yeah, so we'll talk about it another time. But anyway, the sharps and the flats version of the circle of fifths does everyone a major disservice because it is so abstract and it's so confusing. Who really cares about the sharps and flats when you realize that the underlying pattern of whole steps and half steps is really all that matters? So if we look back at this, it's like, oh, okay. Yeah. It's whole steps and half steps. And that's why we're starting to introduce more sharps and flats. And then even better than that, if we just look at it as the actual patterns of whole steps and half steps using the squares and circles, that's even more insightful. And then with the colors that highlight like X-ray vision, the underlying relationships that are going on, that's even more insightful. But even more than that, to be able to see that why any given key sounds good is because of that rotation between the chromatic scale and the circle of fifths. Just for one more, let's look at the A major scale. So it's A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. We have three sharps. It seems like that should be more complex or more complicated than the key of C. Really, it's not. It's whole steps and half steps. And when you rotate those into the circle of fifths, you can see, oh, it's the same idea. It's just notes that are neighbors in the circle of fifths. And because they happen to creep into the black keys of the circle of fifths, once you rotate it, you still have those black keys. But it really doesn't matter. And the same idea, it doesn't matter, meaning that the whole steps and half steps are all that matter. And then the same idea applies to all of the other keys. Like I say, all of these are, I'll have a post in the library with all of these diagrams so you can play them. And there's the key of F. Okay, so just to recap here, we have the three concentric rings, chromatic scale in the inner ring, the major scale in the middle ring, and the circle of fifths in the outer ring. So this is one look at how those three patterns, the holy trinity of musical patterns, are related. They're concentric rings. They basically are derived from each other. They're fractal. Music is like this badass fractal universe that like folds back on itself. It's self-referential. And this is one way that it shows that as concentric rings. Another is how those three patterns can rotate into one another and form different iterations of the same patterns in the form of the pitch space of the chromatic scale and the circle of fifths that reveals the connections between notes in the major scale. The major scale is kind of like the missing link between those two patterns and like ties them together. And the major scale itself is also the source of all of the different modes and the chords and progressions. So looking at music like this is much more insightful because when you get down to it, it's all just patterns. And looking at music like this is totally confusing and throws you for a loop. unless you want to spend years studying. And for some people, I feel bad for them that they spend thousands of dollars on university tuition to come to this and then just be scratching their head and not wanting to admit that it don't make no sense. And then just thinking of these relationships as kind of like Pangea. It's kind of cool how these natural patterns kind of show up in different ways, whether it's music and relationships between pitches, or even just the before and after of tectonic plates and all of that. It's kind of fun. So that is an overview of why scales sound so good. Like I said, I'll have these diagrams in the library so you can check them out and play the patterns, because it's having the head knowledge transfer into hand knowledge. All right, I'm going to jump into some of the comments and catch up because I've missed some of them. Gustavo, very cool to see you on from Chicago. Joe McCarthy, hello to you. Rodney, hello from Ottawa. Very cool to see you on. Stephen C in Lexington, Kentucky. That's awesome. Here, I'm not showing these, but I am now. So Stephen, very cool. I'm glad to see you here tonight. And yes, so Stephen Chestnut, I'm on I can't see it. It's a good point. I'm on these diagrams. I get so excited that I forget to switch the button. So I'm committing to being more on it as we go. Okay, so let's see. Hey, Jack. Very cool. It's good to see you on. Hope you're rocking and rolling. Alapico, aloha. Good to see you on. Hopefully this is making sense. All of this talk about Pangea and the different intervals and relationships between notes. Yeah, so Jack, so they're parallel. Was I showing, and just to get up to speed, was I showing like a version of this? I'm behind on my comment, so it's not real time, my response to this. So if I can clarify a point, let me know. Let's see. Yes. DAA, if I'm saying that correctly, yes, this is live, and all of these videos are available after the fact, so you can watch the whole thing. If you joined midway, you can always watch it after the fact as well. And I'm glad to see you on. Let's see. All right. Matthew Edmonton in the house, right on, representing from Edmonton. Love it. So happy that you're here. Let's see. Okay, so Matthew, bit of a noob here. Does the circle of fifths relate to intervals, e.g. a flatted third? Okay, that's a great question, and let's look at that. So let me think of how to describe that. We have, yeah, so all of these relationships, and I might be behind the times in, okay, so I think I'm on your latest comment on that topic. So the chromatic scale is, we're just going to use the key of F as our example here, okay? So if you treat a note, this means that it's the tonic, meaning that it's the 1, okay? So we're going to make this a 1, and then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Oh, that was upside. I'm trying to write upside down. I thought I'd made it all the way until that last one. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are the scale degrees in the key of F, with F being the tonic or scale degree 1. Okay. So when we make that rotation, we have now the numbers show up in a different formation, but it still applies to the circle of fifths. So we have 1. 1 is straddled by 4. 5. I should have 5, and then we have 2, 6, 3, and 7 because of that rotation. So in the case of the chromatic scale, it's a little easier to make sense of things because all of the numbers are in order. So the flat 3, for example, is right here in the key of F because you have a 3 and then you have a flatted 3, which in this case would be A flat, okay? The flatted 3 is right here because of that rotation. So you have, and really you can think of it like this. You have 1, 2, and 3, right? 1, 2, and 3 that are straddled by 4, 5, 6, and 7. So that's how, at a glance, you can kind of make sense of how am I looking at these numbers? And then this flat 3 is over here. Now, if we were to look at the circle of fifths, these relationships are form a different pattern. So if we look at the key of F, for example, where F is 1, this flat 3, A flat is over here, because of the flat 3 shows up in the key of like F Aeolian, where F minor is the minor 1. The flat 3 shows up in that mode. In no way am I thinking this makes a whole lot of sense. There's some patterns and some explanation that lead up to that, so that there's some context. But at a high level look, does the circle of fifths relate to intervals? Yes, it is intervals. It's just a different formation of intervals that basically highlights the harmonic relationships between notes based on the underlying connections between major scales and the intervals that form those. And then all of the scale degrees, whether they're 1, 2, flat 3, 3, 4, they show up. They're just in a different arrangement. That might have been more confusing than clarifying, but the short answer is yes, they're all there. And in some other videos, I do walk through what I just kind of skimmed through really fast, and we can dive into those in more detail as well as we go. All right, so Dea, very cool, if I'm saying that correctly, and thank you for the clarification, because I want to say it right. And welcome. So from the UK, very cool. Okay, so you're in the UK right now, so that would be you're later on in the evening. So hope it's a beautiful evening for you. Okay, so Delta 4, 12, 12. No disrespect, but I can get the circle of fifths. But I get the circle of fifths, but I don't understand your system of colored squares and circles. You have a video explaining it. Yes, thank you for the question, because there is definitely a logic to this. In fact, it brings up a good point, because I've had conversations sometimes where people are like, don't the squares and circles, in fact, the short answer to your question is there's a live stream that I did. Well, there's a lot of videos on the channel that explain it, but there's a live stream specifically that talks about why you use colors and shapes, that answers that question like more directly. But there's some other videos like Music Theory in 19 Minutes that explains where these patterns come from and all of that. But to the broader question, because it's a good question. It's been framed sometimes like, hey, what's up with the use of colors and shapes? Doesn't that add another symbol set on top of all of the letters and numbers that, for a lot of people are complicated as it is? So why introduce more symbols? And what I get at in the why use colors and shapes, the short answer to that is because you kill multiple birds with one stone. There's the kill two birds with one stone, but you actually do a lot more with the colors and shapes. The idea being that letters are just applied to music arbitrarily. Okay, here are some of the main things. Letters represent pitches or notes, but letters themselves, the alphabet is linear. It's just when you get to A to Z, it doesn't loop back onto itself. The colors loop back onto themselves because colors are inherently cyclical, just like music is inherently cyclical. Also, the symbol set of numbers for scale degrees, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we wrap around to the octave of 8, but it's like 1 to 8. 8 and 1 are the same. And numbers, a number line is inherently linear, whereas music is inherently cyclical. So both letters and numbers are actually not properly suited to communicating musical ideas. And there are two symbol sets that you have to overlay and mentally reconcile to understand musical patterns. whereas the colors actually show the harmonic relationships between the notes, and the shapes, the squares and circles, just highlight the whole steps and half steps, which are fundamental. They're the intervals of whole steps and half steps are the building blocks for all patterns, including scales and modes and chords and progressions. They're all just combinations of intervals. Music is all about intervals. So a better way to depict intervals more intuitively is using these alternating shapes better than the letters and numbers. Like if you look at the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, you have to translate in your head, oh, the even numbers are 2 and 4. This squiggly line and this squiggly line are evenly spaced. Those are even numbers. This is an abstract concept. And then odd numbers are 1 and 3. Those are odd numbers that are evenly spaced. So a curly Q 3 and a straight line 1, those are evenly spaced. And then on top of that, because music uses scale degrees that are not evenly spaced, because they're following whole steps and half steps, you have this like staggered sequence of numbers in even just a given octave that is confusing. But the underlying colors and shapes highlight the patterns. Music is all about patterns. So if you have a more intuitive interface to see what these patterns are and the relationships between the notes, because music is about patterns and intervals, that's why the colors and shapes are a cleaner, more insightful interface than traditional symbols, certainly more than tablature and notation. Notation, if it was software like developed today, it would be laughed out of the room because it is such a terrible user interface. It is completely counterintuitive. In the library, I have a music theory course that gets into music notation in lesson 10. It waxes philosophical and goes deep into why notation is flawed and why those symbols are more confusing than clarifying. So maybe this is kind of a long answer to a short question, but that's really what it gets at. And definitely check out the other videos that talk through that. And thank you for your question, because it's one that I get a lot, and there's definitely a lot of points that highlight why, but those kind of get at the heart. Okay, so Virtuous Heretic Delta, he loves genuine questions like yours. Yes, I do. Thank you for your question. So, okay, so Vera, one day it will click for me. Been feeling inadequate every time I try to make sense of it. And that's cool because it will click. In fact, I remember when it really clicked for me, and actually it was when I had been studying the patterns of music obsessively for a long time, because I knew there was something to it. And I started thinking, man, it would be cool if you could like see musical patterns. If there was a way to like actually see those patterns. And it's kind of far out, but what if like color actually would reveal those patterns? And so I remember the night the connection that I saw, the connection where I was like, oh my God, the chromatic scale and the circle of fifths are just rotations of each other, and the colors highlight that. I couldn't sleep. Like I didn't sleep all night. Like it was amazing. So when that clicks, it'll be euphoria, because it's wonderful. Okay, so Matthew, okay, so far so good. Now, what makes a perfect fifth perfect? Thanks for your patience. That's a great question. Okay, so and I just want to see if there have been comments about that. I'll speak to it. So it's perfect because, and actually, in a recent live stream, I talked about, just so you know, I plugged in my iPad here on the side because it was totally dead a few minutes before this live stream. So I just kind of juicing it up here on the side whenever I can, but I need to share my screen on this. Hold on. Okay. So a perfect fifth. We're going to go to the key of C. There was a recent live stream where we talked about the like terminology used in music. There's a whole lot of layers of symbols used in music, and a lot of them are synonymous. Most of the symbols relate to intervals, because like I said, intervals are where it's at. Intervals, music is about intervals. Dave Youssef once said that music is the space between the notes. And he was talking about intervals, just like in space, in like the solar system, close to home, the planets and the moons wouldn't have any meaning without the context of space. You have to have that vacuum or that gap between objects or entities to give meaning to the content. So just like in space, the vacuum of space is really as important as the objects themselves. Just like atoms are mostly empty. Music is mostly the space between the notes. So anyway, all that to say that the intervals between notes have many names. Perfect is one of them. So if we look at the major scale, so we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and back to C. So C, the tonic, has this special relationship between intervals 4 and 5, because if we rotate them back into their old neighborhood, 4 and 5 are like its closest relatives or its closest friends. And this perfect 5 and perfect 4 are perfect. This is going to be just kind of a high level answer. So there's a lot to it, but basically it's just because it's so closely related, and progressions tend to move in a counterclockwise direction from this fifth, the dominant fifth, to the tonic. It also has to do, like if we looked at these patterns in the circle of thirds, which is another formation of notes as they relate harmonically, the fifth is like in a position of tension. Well, we can look at it right here. So we have the C major chord, for example. So C, E, and G. If we play the fifth chord, which is G, we have two notes that straddle C in the G major chord. This D, the second, wants to resolve to C, and this B, the seventh interval, is also called a leading tone. It wants to lead to C. So we have that perfect fifth is so perfect because it wants to resolve. It has a lot of harmonic tension that wants to resolve to that 5. Also because that 5 is closely related to the 1, because 1 wants to be where its tritone is, which is nestled between its perfect 4 and its perfect 5. They're perfectly related. They're perfectly compatible. More to it than that, but hopefully it kind of like gives you at least a sense of why that of all notes would have the moniker of perfect. Okay, so wow, it's 0139. So right on. You're a night owl, and hopefully the juices are flowing in the night, and this is making some sense. Okay, so you may not last until the end, but hopefully you're in a safe, comfortable place. All right, so why is it so difficult when it should be simple? Sometimes I feel like I'll never understand. So if you haven't checked out the course in the library, one of the things that I hate about professors I've had in the past are when they use the term "of course," where they're like, "Oh, of course," and then they go on and explain something that's like, I'm sitting there in my chair thinking, "Of course." It's not obvious. Why you're like skipping so many steps. I'm missing something. And so I definitely can relate to the feeling of like, wait a sec, these dots should be connecting. I should be connecting the dots. And so with the course in the library, with that like fully ingrained in me, where I'm just like, I hate assumptions. And in a context like this, like I'm definitely kind of skimming over a lot of things, and I'm not expecting, if you don't have some of the background, it may not make total sense, but you can at least see, because music theory is visual, that there is something to it. It's just, okay, maybe there's some dots that you need to plot to fill in the picture. Those dots that are plotted in order, beginning with lesson 1 in the course, assumes no prior knowledge. So it starts with like at square one, pardon the pun. Like it talks about squares and circles, the underlying intervals of whole steps and half steps, and in layers that are logically built upon each other, it explains how we come to use this terminology. but I'm talking about perfect fourths, perfect fifths, chromatic scale, circle of fifths, rotation, like at a pace that isn't necessarily going to be like, you might not have the aha moment at this pace, but definitely check out the course if you haven't already. And there's lots of exercises, quizzes, like it goes at a pace that is meant to be helpful. All right. Okay, sorry, getting up to speed here. So I have lost my place. Here it is. Okay. So you said, I actually learned to read music with colors when I was a child, and I still remember the colors of the notes now. That's interesting. Yeah, there's something about, and actually, I can't remember the percentage of the brain that is allocated towards vision, but much of the brain is allocated towards vision. So to be able to visualize things, that's the thing about traditional music and notation and tablature and all of these archaic symbol sets that are normally used in music, is that it has seemed like a disservice or a disadvantage, I should say, to be a visual learner traditionally, because those auditory learners, or those who could just like pick it up and hear it and they're like, yeah, I got it. It's like they just smoked us all because they got it, because they weren't disadvantaged by the counterintuitive symbol sets that we've been shackled to as visual learners. But now that you can actually see music, which is the definition of music theory, which means to see sound, to actually be able to see these patterns as they really are, using the natural patterns of sight to see the otherwise invisible patterns of music, is now an advantage. And that memory and to use that much horsepower in your brain allocated to color actually really does help. There's like a science behind it, which is awesome. Okay, so Dave, you said, I actually see the colors when I play them. It's weird but true. That's awesome. Within your mind's eye as well as your actual eyes. That's awesome. I understand that, Mike, but I think it's a little too complicated for people who haven't learned the color method way. Yeah, so a lot of times, especially if you're just new to this and you're seeing, oh, I'm seeing these patterns, sometimes people need to see it a few times, or sometimes they need just a little bit of background context, or sometimes I've been surprised by some of the comments that I've gotten on videos or just in exchanges I've had where they're like, I get it. Like they can see it and it clicks. And that might be based on some of the previous studies that they've done. That was the case with me, where I was obsessively studying music, like an imbalanced life kind of obsessive study of music, where it was, when I could finally see the patterns, it was like, oh, that's it. It's almost like I was listening to, some pirate radio station, and was hearing conversations, between some people. And then to finally meet the people, it was just like, hey, I feel like I know you, because even though it's been from afar, like, hey, we finally meet. It was kind of like that with seeing the patterns. It was like vaguely understanding the patterns through the traditional archaic symbol sets of letters and numbers and all of that. And then to actually finally see them, it was like, oh, it all makes sense. Like I had this hunch, or I had this intuitive sense, or I could hear it, or I could kind of see it through the dust of traditional symbols. To finally see it, it all clicked. So like I say, the course in the library starts at ground zero with no assumption of prior knowledge, because the more people with access to music, the better. So, I don't want to present a first step that you just can't reach. That's why it starts at ground zero. Dave, you said, I think if you equate the circle of fifths to the circle of color and frequency, it makes more sense. Yeah, that's interesting. And to be able to see these patterns, ultimately understanding the relationships is what it's all about. To be able to see how every layer builds upon the last, that the chromatic scale leads to the major scale, that leads to the circle of fifths, that wraps back into the chromatic scale, which is the formation of the major scale, which is the formation of modes, which is the formation of melodies and chords and progressions. They all build on each other. So to be able to see it is totally where it's at. Okay, Denidra, you said colors and shapes are found in nature, abstract symbols are not. So yeah, colors and shapes are, and for sure, the man-made archaic symbols of, I mean, we use Arabic numbers all the time in math, and they're very helpful, and they help us calculate distances and, time and value and all of that. So they are helpful as abstractions, but they definitely obscure things when it comes to music, especially because music is kind of a different animal. It's cyclical and it's symmetrical and it's fractal. And to try to use man-made symbols to communicate that is like, it's almost it is a losing proposition. Like you have to kind of go back to nature to see nature. Oh no, that's good. This is all about a cool conversation today about, achieving an understanding of music. To music theory is a means to an end. The end ultimately is music and songwriting, at least it is for me. And so to how to get there is one question, and to get there is another question. And to be able to connect with music, with others and yourself is what it's all about. So I love it. Okay, so Anil Rao, if I'm saying that correctly, great analysis would suggest all theory and logic explanation be accompanied with instances of practical playing. That would help register more applicability or more applicably. Thanks very much. Thank you for your feedback. Yes. So going back and forth between like diagrams like this and then to the patterns, definitely taking that feedback to heart and not just having it be head knowledge, but transferred into hand knowledge. And for the practical application, like I say, these diagrams will be in the library so that you can play the patterns and really get a feel for them. Because you definitely don't want to stop with just, okay, the video's over, done. Like you want to, absorb it, hear it, because music is an audible auditory art form. So yes. And as far as these videos go, I'm looking to incorporate that as well. That's good feedback. Okay. So, all right. Dave, you said, yes, it's all about good conversations and arriving at truths, which is what it's all about. This is what life is about. Okay. So you've been watching on YouTube for a few months now and have been dying to see one live. I love the streams. Very cool. I'm so glad you're here. And we're a bunch of musical heretics when it comes to approaching music from a non-dogmatic approach, which is traditional notation. It's been entrenched as the de facto method of learning music for almost a millennium. We're coming up on the 1,000 year anniversary in 2026. So we're due for some interesting, insightful conversations about music. Okay, so you said I would say to look at the circle of fifths and look at your own patterns. There are thousands. When I was studying piano exams, right up to grade 8, I really didn't see some of them. The circle of fifths, because I didn't look at it and study it. Teachers in the 70s and 80s didn't teach you. They expect you to know these things. Yeah, and I've said in previously that like something like the circle of fifths, which is foundational, is often relegated to the footnotes, partly because it's depicted as a ring of key signatures, which is mind-blowingly abstract. It's the first way that I saw it depicted. And because it's such a circuitous, winding route through notation to arrive at the circle of fifths, as I talk about in lesson 10 of the course, it just makes sense that it's an afterthought, when really it should be step one, if not step 1, step 2 or 3 in the journey of understanding music, which I talk about in lesson 1. So yeah, there's music for sure needs an overhaul as a topic. John, you said there's an entire library of videos that explain this on the channel. He builds on these concepts quite well. I would highly recommend them. Thank you, John. I appreciate it. I'm so glad to hear that they're helpful for you. That's what it's all about. It's I said that I was obsessively studying music theory to arrive at color music, but the obsession never went away. I'm speaking of it in the past tense, but it's still very much a thing. And so the library is expanding all the time. And thank you, John. I appreciate your feedback. Let's see. Robert, you said, great live stream. What's the connection between the scale degrees and chord progressions like 1, 4, 5? So that's a great question. In some other videos, I talk about it where, and I think my iPad may have died. I might not be able to show it. Oh no, I still have juice. So in a nutshell, the scale degrees, basically you take the major, let me show my screen. Hold on. Okay, I'm just going to draw it here because I don't have the diagram, but there's lots of explanations in like the modes playlist and chords playlist and all that. But I'm right below Pangea here. I've got a little bit of white space. So if you take, let's just take, these aren't colors, but I am going to use the whole steps and half steps to illustrate the point. That, oh, you know what? Even better than that, I'm just going to play it on a keyboard. So we have key of C, so C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Or in the key of C, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Or scale degree 1, scale degree 2, scale degree 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you take that pattern and just combine every other note, these are actually tertian intervals. Tertian means thirds, intervals of major and minor thirds. If you play every other note, you have a 1 chord, and it's a capital 1 or an uppercase 1 because it's a major chord. If you use that same underlying pattern and play every other note starting on the second scale degree, you have a minor 2 because it's a minor third right there. And then if you start on the third scale degree, every other note, you have a minor 3 because it's a minor 3 chord, an E minor chord, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1. So 1, 4, 5, and 1 is the basis of like the 12-bar blues. So you're just building chords based on those underlying scale degrees of the pattern. And the same idea applies to all of the different modes and all of that, because again, music is fractal, it's self-referential, and the same patterns are recycled. When you have only 12 notes, music gets really creative to personify it all in how it repurposes notes and recycles notes and is self-referential. It's amazing. Okay, so I'm going to get through just a couple more comments here, and then we'll wrap it up for this evening and jump into getting ready for the next one. So, all right, let me just. Hey, Dave, you're a night nurse, right on. So you are a vampire. Very cool. You have, I mean, it's later for you, and I feel like you're like totally sharp and awake and amazing. So you must be a night nurse. Okay, so let me just, okay. Lindertube said, hopefully the juices are flowing in the night. Yeah, the night juices are good. Let's see. All right. I'm just seeing some of the comments here. Okay, so John, you said, just join in. Apologies if this has already been addressed, but is there something to say about the way the second note in the major scale has notes at equal distances away? Okay, that's a good question. And I'm glad you asked the question. So, all right, so if you can see my keyboard. So in the key of C, we're going to do this upper octave now. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So if I'm understanding correctly, and point out if I'm misinterpreting your question, but D, this second scale degree, in the key of C, D is the second scale degree because it's 1, 2, 3. D has a whole step on this side and also a whole step on this side. And that relationship between these three notes, so for example, if you took these three notes and you swapped them out with their tritones, so that they're nestled between their friends, like we talked about earlier in this video, that D would be at the very center of the group. And let me show that in a diagram here. So, for example, if you can ignore my markup lines. Okay, there we go. So this D, the second scale degree, when you do the rotation, it happens to be at the center point in this adjacent grouping of notes. And there, to answer your question, the short answer is yes, there is a significance to that. And part of it has to do with its relationships. It's highly related to some really important notes, at least in the Ionian mode or the major key. Ionian is a fancy way of saying major. It's related to the perfect fourth and the relative minor of C. So D is friends of friends. Like if these were people, the second scale degree is highly connected in that network of notes because of that strong relationship with the dominant and the relative minor as they relate to the tonic. So there's that. I'm not explaining it to the length that we could go, but it's a great topic for another video that my juices are flowing now in terms of the topic there. And then also, because of this situation, it is perfectly nestled in this harmonic relationship network of notes that it also plays into the way that the Dorian mode, the Dorian is a mode, a permutation of this pattern that is built on the second scale degree. And there's a certain vibe and sound to Dorian, and it has to do with that special position in the group. So yes, the short answer is yes. There's a longer answer to the special position that it has, but at least at a high level, that's the answer. A great question. Okay, and you had a second half that I missed that you'd asked. So, for example, scale degrees 1 and 3 are the same distance, 2, or 4 and 7, 5 and 6. Yes. So, and then you said there's definitely some symmetry there. I just can't figure out the significance. Yep. So the symmetry, there's symmetry about the Dorian mode. I have multiple videos about the Dorian mode. People have asked, why do you care so much about the Dorian mode? One, because it sounds awesome, and two, because there's some really cool symmetry and music theory going on there, and also because of its special relationship to the dominant and the relative minor, among other things. Yeah. Elgato 9. Okay, last couple of questions here. Dear Mike, I arrived late. Don't, if this has been mentioned, but can you explain why there are 3 different types of minor scales? Yes, there are 3 minor scales. Let's say that we take the key of C, for example, where C is 1. If we rotate this so that we're looking at the Aeolian mode, which is like the most famous of the minor scales, where now C minor is 1. In the circle of fifths, all of these chords in the inner ring are major, as represented by the uppercase Roman numerals. All of these chords in the middle ring are minor, as shown by the lowercase numerals, and then all of these are diminished around the perimeter. So with C, you have Aeolian, where C is 1. If you have C, where C is 1, but now we have this grouping, it's a permutation of the B flat major scale. C is 1, but it's now C Dorian. And then if we come over here, where C minor 1, but it's a permutation of the A flat major scale, C is the 1, but it's C Phrygian. So where C shows up as the 1, it shows up as the 1 in 3 groupings: Phrygian, Aeolian, and Dorian, which all happen to be neighbors in the circle of fifths, because there's more to this whole neighbors thing in the circle of fifths when it comes to modes. So what I mean, music is fractal. These relationships keep showing up in different ways. Okay, so cool. Thank you, John. That the answer at least was somewhat insightful, if not totally clarifying. And then Elgato, just on the topic, you notice that this in quite a few songs with the minor, but the only one that comes to mind is the one called When Thugs Cry by Tupac. It's an F minor key. I decided to improv to that, but the minor 3 scales. Yeah, so those 3 modes, Phrygian, Aeolian, and Dorian, are the minor modes, because they're founded on or resolved to a minor 1 as the tonic. So that will be it for this evening. Such awesome questions, and great comments about all sorts of things. I feel like we jumped around a lot on music theory, and so there is so much more to cover, and that'll be one of those topics will show up in the next live stream. So thank you for joining. As always, it's cool to geek out with you about music, and we will be talking very soon. Have a good one.